Hello, this is Section B as we're beginning to talk about how to do a case. Part of your particular training in this course is that you will learn how to work through cases so that you can really be thorough when it's time to do real counseling and processing through the thinking procedures of working with an individual. And so we'll start with cases so that you can analyze, categorize, take things to the framework, and then move into solving the problem. And so our philosophy is if we can teach you how to do it with the case, this should prepare you to be equipped to work with people in real time. Now, before we actually do a case through your workbook, because I want to give you an example of what I'm expecting from you, I want to first show you how to put together a workbook. And I want to show you this. This is a workbook that you will use for a case, and this just kind of is laid out. It has some things, biblical counseling practicum, and basically what you're going to do is put together a workbook of the materials that you already have purchased to help you research for a case. And so what I'd like to do is share with you how you're going to put this together using the tools you already have. So go get your Heart of Man and Mental Disorders book, whether you have the first edition or the second edition. Make sure you go and pick up, if you don't have it, go get your practicum book, Biblical Counseling Practicum, and we're just going to take some resources out of those two books that you already have purchased, and we're going to show you how to put together a workbook so that when you're doing research for your case, again, you don't have to keep going back and forth to books. You can just use your own little workbook. So notice I want you to do this and get some tabs put together and just have your stuff available. Okay? Now, let's talk about how we're going to do this. So the first step is this. You're going to create a workbook, and you're going to have one section on that workbook. You're going to call that section Negative Expressions of the Framework. Okay? Negative Expressions of the Framework. What I want you to do is I'm going to read some of this to you. You're going to go to pages 160 and 161 in this book. And on that page, you're going to see expressions of a lack of love. You're going to see a sense of guilt. A parent calls fear. A parent calls fleeing. And you're going to put that in this section because when you're starting to do the research, you want to be able to not try to guess what those things are. You want to be able to research what those things are as you're going through a case. And this will help you because you'll put all this information in a section. So this section will be called the Negative Expressions of the Framework. So again, you're going to go to page 160, 161, and you're going to pull out those pages, make copies, and put in that section of the workbook. Also, what I want you to do, if you have the second edition of the Heart of Man and Mental Disorders, I want you to make copies of these pages. Please go turn to these pages, pages 711 to pages 728, and pages 1225 to pages 1235. Let me say that again. If you have the second edition, and that will be the red book and not the blue book of the Heart of Man, you're going to go to pages 711 and 728 and pages 1225 and 1235. So all of those pages you want to go to and you want to Xerox copy them out of your book that you purchased, okay? Because it's legal when it's your book that you purchased, and you're going to put those things together. Now, if you have the older copy of this book, and that would be the blue copy, then you're going to go and copy pages 499 to 517 and 985 to 996, okay? Now, go get your books if you don't have them because I want you to look at these pages. So if you have the red book, turn to page 711, and you're going to look at all those pages to pages 728, make copies of that. Turn to page 1225. You're going to turn there, look at all those pages up until 1235. You're going to make copies of those. If you have the blue book, again, you're going to go to page 499. to pages 517. Make copies of that, pages 985 to pages 996. In those sections, you will discover that Rich Thompson has laid out for you categories of different things that show expressions of a lack of love, expressions of a sense of guilt, expressions of AU fear, expressions of AU fleeing. Now, what's interesting, what he's done is that he does it by numbers. So when you see a particular category or thing, let's say if it's fear or neglect or something, whatever you're looking at, if you see the numbers 1, 2, 3, or 4, those follow the framework. For instance, number 1 means lack of love. Number 2 means sense of guilt. Number 3 means AU fear. Number 4 means AU fleeing. So what happens, let's say you are looking in the workbook and you're doing your case and something says, excessive worry or just whatever it may be, and then you go and you find that particular thing in your pages and it has the numbers 2 and 3 by it or 3 and 4 by it. You go, well, wait a minute, what does that mean? That means that that particular thing could be a demonstration of, if it's a 2, it could be a demonstration of a sense of guilt. If it has 2 and 3 by it, it means it could also be a demonstration of AU fear. If it only has 1 number by it, that means that that particular item is an expression of that number. Let's say you go look up an item and has a number 4 by it. That means it's a demonstration of AU fleeing. If it just has the number 3 by it, that means it's a demonstration of AU fear. If it just has the number 2 by it, that means it's a demonstration of a sense of guilt. If it just has the number 1 by it, it just means it's a demonstration of a lack of love. So what you want to do is you want to look at the numbers, and sometimes if it has more than 1 number, what you're going to do in your research, you're going to keep looking at the case to say, in this particular case, is this a demonstration of AU fear, or is this a demonstration of AU fleeing? Is this a demonstration of a sense of guilt? You just want to begin to look at that and use that as a guide. Now, let me encourage you in this. Not everything that you're looking for you will find through these pages, so don't get too used to it, but use it as a means of research. There may be something in a case to where you may not find that particular expression, but you may find something like that expression in your research. You want to gauge and identify, are they similar, are they alike? Part of this goal is to teach you how to distinguish between AU fleeing, AU fear, sense of guilt, lack of love, and just to see how that all works together so that as you're listening to people, you will do some evaluation, okay? So that will be the part of your workbook, okay? Negative expressions of the framework, and you're going to put these things in that particular section. Now, you're going to create another section of your workbook called Expressions of Love Toward God and Others. Expression of love towards God and others, or expressions of love towards God and others. Now, in your practicum on pages 162 to pages 164, it shows some expressions of love towards God. It shows the 4 levels of relating, or the 4 kinds of relationships, and it also has some general expressions of love towards others. You want to take that and copy that and put that in this section of your workbook for your research. Now, you're going to discover when you do a case that there's going to come a time where you want to explain or identify an expression of love that a person needs to walk in towards God and others. Well, instead of running and trying to find the workbooks, you're going to have copies of those within this particular workbook that you're making that you've Xeroxed from here. Okay? So, pages 162 to pages 164. Now, from the Heart of Man book, if you have the 2nd edition, that's the red book, you're going to go to these pages. You're going to go to pages 611 to pages 676. So if you have it with you, turn to those pages now. And if not, please go get your book, because I want you to see this. On pages 611 to pages 676, you will find that there are many expressions of love specifically defined to the context of a relationship. So I want you to go there. If you have the older copy, perhaps you have the blue book of the Heart of Man, that's the 1st edition. You want to turn to pages 379 and 465. From 379 to 465, it has the exact same information, and it shows hundreds of expressions of love that you can have towards others within the context of the relationship. I want you to take those pages and I want you to copy them and pull them together. So now, in this section, notice the first section, you have negative expressions. And in negative expressions, you're going to pull things out of the back of the practicum, and you're pulling things out of the Heart of Man workbook. The second category in your workbook with your tab is going to be expressions of love towards God. You're going to take things again from 162 to 164 in your practicum, which has some expressions of love towards God and again the 4 kinds of relationships and expressions of love towards others in a general sense. And then you're going to pull out of the Heart of Man, the red book, pages 611 to pages 676. And if you have the first edition, which is the blue copy, pages 379 to 465, and you're going to put this in that section. And when it comes down to identifying what expressions of love towards God the person needs to walk in, or what expressions of love towards others the person needs to walk in, then you're going to use this as your guide to help you identify where you need to go. Okay? So, now, you're going to create a third section in your workbook called Key Concepts. Key Concepts. Now, in the appendix of your book, and again, the practicum book, on pages 153 to 154, you're going to pull out some key concepts that you think the person should learn. And we'll be, as we go through and look at the information we're going to walk through with a actual case, you'll see how significant that will be. And so as you pull out those particulars, it's going to be important for you. Okay? So in the appendix of the practicum workbook called copy pages 153 to 154 would show key concepts you want to teach to help lead counselees into biblical change, and put this in the section of your workbook. In your appendix practicum, copy page 159, which shows the biblical framework. So you want to take those and put them in there, and that is going to help you, if you will, to pull together a workbook for research, so that as you are working through a case, you will begin to have this information and use it to do a case. Now, what I'd like for you to do is to turn in your workbook. We're going to do the first case together. And I want you to turn in your workbook, and I want you to look with me on page, let's see what page we have here. We're looking at case number 1, and case number 1 starts on page 26. Now, before we look at this case, I want you to notice and walk with me as you see this. In your workbook, you've got different things like number 1, and then you've got a number 2, and then you have a number 3, you have a number 4, you have a number 5. Number 6 is not for you to worry about right now. We'll be talking about number 6 when you get to the dynamics of biblical counseling, the process course. So for right now, your concern is with number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, and then you skip number 6 for future references. Now, what I want you to think about when we're doing a case, and somewhere in your workbook, I want you to write this down. By number 1, I want you to put the word observation. By number 2, I want you to put the word interpretation. By number 3, 4, and 5, I want you to put application. Okay? What we're doing is we're taking the framework, the biblical framework, and we are working it in detail via a case. So, if you think about number 1, what we're trying to do is to identify expressions or demonstrations of any AU fleeing, any AU fear, any sense of guilt, or secondary unloving attitudes. At number 2, this is interpretation. We're taking the information now in number 1, observation, and as we're looking at these things and observing the case, we're saying, as we are observing the case at this point, is there any demonstrations of those things we just mentioned? And if they are, we're going to write them down as we see them. Now again, we're looking for demonstrations of those things. In other words, we're not trying to fill in the blanks to say, oh, I've got to get all A through D filled in. No. That's not how it works. A through D are here to help you evaluate. And so the idea is, do you see within the context of the case anything being demonstrated that would be AU fleeing, AU fear, sense of guilt, or secondary unloving attitudes? And if you see them, you write them down. If you don't see them, you don't write them down. And that's why you're going to do your research to make sure that you're evaluating in the proper manner. Now, section 2 is where we get to identifying, and this is interpretation now, what is the lack of love specific that's causing the things we see that we've observed in number 1. Now, here's where you may get confused. When you do number 2 is your best educated guess. Okay? And what I mean by that is there are many possible options. Your job is to try to figure out what could be the most specific option that could be causing the lack of, or the AU fear, the AU fleeing, or the sense of guilt. So what you're trying to do is you're saying, okay, as I get to number 2, I recognize the lack of love is causing all of these things that I see in number 1. However, I need to identify what could the specific lack of love be that's creating the problem. And you've got 5 options to choose from. Is it an attitude that's causing it? Is it a communication issue? Is it a behavior or lifestyle? Is it a way of relating? Is it a desire issue? What is the specific lack of love in number 2 that's created what's in number 1? And by the way, you cannot, for lack of better words, research an answer to where you're going to find it as you look. You're going to have to use your best educated guess according to the research that you have done to find the demonstrations of apparently uncaused fleeing or apparently uncaused fear or a sense of guilt or secondary unloving attitudes. As you see that, you get to number 2, again, interpretation. Number 1, observation. Number 2, interpretation. You say, you know what? Given what I see in section 1, I believe the issue or the lack of love is anger or worry or whatever you may be. And that's where you have your workbook, and it has a list of possibilities of lack of love issues that are most common that we'll find. And you'll use that list to say, given this list, and then you may think outside the box. I think the issue is anger or worry or jealousy or envy. And if it is, you would say, well, that's an attitude, and you put that under the category of attitude. And then you would say, well, based upon my research, I believe this is what's creating what we see in section 1. So from there, from section 1 to section 2, and let me just read it. It says, connect the specific characteristics of the problem to the biblical framework. Again, observation. As you look at the characteristics of the situation or problem, are there any expressions of uncaused fleeing being demonstrated? Well, what does that mean? As you're looking at the case and you're reading it, do you see any demonstrations of apparently uncaused fleeing? You go, well, yeah, there's a lot of them. So then you write those down. Second, it says, letter B, as you look at the characteristics of the situation or problem, are there any expressions of uncaused fear being demonstrated? If so, write them down. You say, well, yeah, I'm seeing some AU fear being demonstrated in this particular thing. And so then you write it down. Now, what if you don't see any? Then you don't write anything down. You only write down in section 1 what you see. Okay? If it's not being demonstrated in the case, you don't write it down. Letter C, as you look at the characteristics of the situation and problem, are there any expressions of a sense of guilt being demonstrated? If so, write them down. So you look at the case, you're going, you know, I don't see any demonstrations or expressions of a sense of guilt. Well, if you don't see it there, you don't write it down. If you see it, you write it down. Now, your key is that your workbook, because you're going to be researching different things that are in the case to see where they fit on the framework, or if not at all, and you're going to just do your research. And you're going to have that workbook where you're looking in there and going, okay, negative expressions. What does a sense of guilt look like? And you look at all of those. What does AU fear, AU fleeing? And as you're looking through all the different combinations and options, you say, you know what? I don't see any of that being demonstrated here. So you don't write it down. Now, letter D, as you look at the characteristics of the situation or problem, are there any secondary unloving sinful attitudes, words, actions, unloving sinful attitudes, words, or actions being expressed as a result of the main unloving sinful attitude, word, or actions being demonstrated? If so, write them down. This is basically second-level sins. In other words, sins that are used as a way of AU fleeing from the primary sin. An example of that would be pornography, masturbation, suicide ideation. Another sin, that's a second-level sin that may be used there, would be homosexuality, AU fleeing, burning things or stealing things as a way of fleeing. These are things that are sin, but they're used as a form of fleeing, apparently uncalled fleeing, from the guilty conscience of not dealing with the primary sin issue. So if you see that, you go, yeah, that's a sin, but that's a secondary sin. That's used as a form of fleeing. You write that down. Or you can take letter D and automatically tie it back to your letter A, because if it's apparently uncalled fleeing, they go together. Now, as I'm sharing this with you, what I want you to see is this is your observation. From your observation, again, you get to number 2, identify the root of the problem. Identify the specific sin, or what we call the lack of love or unloving attitude, word, or action towards God or others you believe is producing the sense of guilt, apparently uncalled fear, or apparently uncalled fleeing. So at that point, you're going to say, well, I've looked at all this information, and I believe that the root issue is blank. And then you would say, well, what is that? Anger, resentment, whatever it is. Well, then that would fit under the category of attitude, and you would put it there to say that's what's causing what we see. That's my interpretation of the observation. Now, you get to section 3, and in section 3, you have, again, application. And this is part of the framework where we start talking about, once you identify from observing, hey, I see the AU fleeing, I see the AU fear or sense of guilt, and now you've recognized on the framework that's a lack of love that's causing all of this. I think the lack of love is blank. Well, whatever you think the lack of love is, remember on the framework, the first step is to confess. You start going down the line, count on forgiveness, be controlled, and count on control. Well, section 3 is a representation of how you will begin to formally walk that through. So in section 3, it says, explain the process of moving the person from practicing the specific sin, or what we call a lack of love or unloving attitude, word, or action towards God, to expressing love for God and others. So notice letter A. It says, what are the specific unloving sinful issues that need to be confessed? Well, what you would do there is you'd say, well, I recognize that his sin, let's say it was anger. Well, I recognize his sin was anger, so then you would put he needs to confess his sinful attitude of anger. Letter B, what do they need to count on being forgiven of by God when they confess? Now notice we're walking through the framework. Confess, count on being forgiven. Well, if he's confessing anger as the lack of love issue, then letter B, what he's counting on being forgiven of is anger. Now letter C, what are the areas of their life they need to walk by the Holy Spirit and not carry out desires of the flesh? This is now walk by the Spirit and count on the control aspect of the Spirit, still going through the framework. Well, if we're looking at this appropriately, what areas of their life? Well, it's in the area of an attitude, since anger is an attitude, and so you would put the attitude area. This person needs to walk in the Spirit in the area of his attitude, because there's anger there that needs to be replaced with something else. Just an example. Letter D, as they do this, what can they expect from God? Well, if they confess the anger, count on being forgiven of God for that anger, and then walk by the Spirit of God in those areas and not walk by the flesh, and again, count on the control is implied here, then they can expect, letter D, that they will be, 1, forgiven. 1, as they're doing this, they will have the peace of God, they'll have a confidence before God, and they'll be drawing near to God. So again, walking through that process, I'm just trying to help you think this through step by step. This is what we're doing as we're walking through a case. You get to step 4, again, more application, and you say, what expressions of love homework assignments you would give to help move the person from practicing the specific sin, or what we call a lack of love or unloving attitude, word, and action towards God and others, to expressing love for God and others. Consider the way you would have them implement these expressions within the context of the problem. Now, this is where you pull out your workbook, and all those expressions that you copied out of your book and workbook that show love for God, and all those expressions that you copied out of your workbook that show love for others, you're going to use that and say, now, if this person has this lack of love issue, let's say it's anger, then I need to show them how to walk in love towards God, and he needs to practice blank. And so you look at the list and go, here are the possibilities. Now, let me do a sidebar for a minute, and I want to teach you just for a quick moment the very first expression of love towards God that you will always use. Now, if you turn in the back of your book for a moment, this is a sidebar, and you look at the section that we talked about, where we're looking at expressions of love towards God, and that would be again, in your section 162. Now, notice when we start talking about expressions of love towards God and expressions of love towards others, for the purpose of this course, you will just focus in primarily on, when you talk about expressions of love towards God, you will focus on page 162 on letters A through H, okay? And as you do this, I'm asking you to give me 3 basic expressions of love towards God. Now notice, A, embracing who God is according to his characteristic. B, thinking on good things, meditating on God's word. C, accepting what God has allowed in your life. D, entrusting oneself to God and doing and standing in what is right according to God's will and thoughts, words, behavior, lifestyle. And by the way, that means standing for right, knowing that you may suffer the consequences. Your boss tells you to lie, you tell him you won't lie, and he says, well, then you can't work for me. And you tell him, I won't, because I will not lie for you. That's what it means to stand for what is right. Thanksgiving for and in all things, worship in spirit and truth, praising God constantly, giving to God's work. These are basic expressions of love towards God that I want you to hone in on and to really use as you say, looking at this lack of love issue that I think this person has, I think he should walk in these expressions of love towards God, and we're going to talk about these 3. Now, before we go any further, I want to encourage you that there is one expression of love towards God that you will always do as your number 1 expression of love towards God. Look at your workbook again, and on page 162, and I want you to notice letter A, embracing who God is according to his character and attributes. Now, every time you come to expressions of love towards God, that is the very first one that I want you to always write down. And you go, well, why is that? Because every sin a person commits is basically because there's something about God they're not entrusting or embracing. So your assignment will be, it will always be, the answer will be always letter A plus anything from B through H. So you may have embracing who God is, and then you may have some other things. But let me hang around embracing who God is first. Now, notice we said that will always be the first expression of love you give. Now, you won't just stop there. Embracing God according to his characteristics. If you look in your workbook, and I want you to turn to page 164. On page 164, notice from left to right, you have characteristics of God to embrace, the perspective we should have as a result of embracing this characteristic, the practice we should develop as a result of embracing this characteristic, and the pattern of relating. Now, what we've laid out for you here are characteristics of God, and this is not comprehensive. These are just some general ones that we believe a person should walk in order to overcome where they lack love for God and others. And so from left to right, there are projects that are tied to each characteristic. So notice characteristics of God to embrace. Number 1, supreme. It has the definition of supreme, and then it has the scripture, and then it has application from there. Okay, what perspective should this person have? They should have the perspective, 1, that according to the fact that God is supreme, I exist for his glory, and you have that verse, okay? What practice should the person develop in as a result of this? Well, they should live for the audience of God alone and put God first, and you have the scripture there. And then what pattern of relating? They should consider God's glory and not your personal gain when relating to others. So notice, each characteristic of God to embrace has several things as far as perspective, as far as practice and pattern that we want the person to walk in order to embrace that about God to overcome their lack of love issue. Your job, when you look at this and you say, okay, expressions of love towards God, number 1 will always be embracing God, okay? And when you say number 1, embracing God, I want you to come to page 164 and say, what are 3 attributes or characteristics of God that I think this person should embrace? Let's say the person has anger. You would say, well, I'm looking at this list here, and it seems like for an angry person, as I look at wise and forgiving and word, faithful and forgiving and merciful, gracious, wise, loving, holy, sufficient, sovereign, supreme, and you study those, you say, now, it seems like a person who's caught up in anger really needs to embrace that God is supreme, because if they had put God first and not themselves first, they wouldn't be angry. Then you would say, well, then they also need to embrace that God is sovereign, because if an angry person accepted that God was sovereign, he was in control of all things, he wouldn't be upset when things didn't go his or her way. And you know what? They probably need to embrace that God is sufficient, because if they saw that God was enough and then put to practice these perspectives, this practice and pattern of relating, they probably wouldn't walk in that lack of love. Okay? So I'm helping you to see, when we do these exercises, number one will always be embracing God. And as they embrace God, you're going to turn and say, according to these particular things. And I want you to write that down in your workbook as you're going through the case and say, they need to, number one, embrace God according to his character and attribute, and according to this lack of love that I've discovered, it should be supreme, or it could be wise. And again, you want to work this through practically. Now, as I've said that, so when we get down to letter A, expressions of love towards God that need to be given within the problem and situation and why. So what's always going to be your first expression of love towards God? If you said embracing, you got it right. And so as you look at embracing God, you're going to turn and tell me what characteristics of God does the person need to embrace. Now, again, go back to that page, and I want you to notice that's only one expression of love towards God. You have two others that I want you to help them walk in. So once you finish with letter A and identifying the three categories or three different characteristics of God that they should embrace that you find on 164, now you look back at your information, and by the way, you're going to have this in your workbook, so you can just flip-flop your pages and not have to go to all different books. And then you're going to say, according to anger, if a person is angry, they should embrace who God is, but I think a person who's angry also needs to learn how to accept what God allows. And I would say, very good. And so then you would put the second expression of love towards God is to accept what God allows, because angry people don't accept what God allows. And I would say, very good. Then you would say, okay, that's two expressions of love towards God. Notice the first one is embracing God according to his characteristics and attributes, and then you would find three. Second, you would look back at your information here and say, okay, accepting what God allows fits for a person who's angry. And then you would find a third. And so you're looking at your list and going, according to what I'm seeing in this person's life, a person who's angry is not a very thankful person. So now notice what you've done. Expressions of love towards God. You've said this person needs to embrace God according to his characteristics and attributes, and I've chosen supremacy or supreme. I've chosen sovereign. I've chosen sufficiency to be the things he needs to embrace. That's the first expression of love towards God. The second expression of love towards God, I notice an angry person does not accept what God allows. So you write that down and say, I need to show him how to accept what God allows. And then the third expression of love towards God, I think, should be thanksgiving. And so then you would write down, he needs to learn how to be thankful. So as you're doing this, you have completed the first part of the case or the first part of expressing love towards God by doing that. Now, the second part is it asks you if it is in a situation, the case where they also need to express love towards others. Now you look at it and say, now what does this person need to walk in order to show love for others? Well, is this a husband and wife? Is this a employee-employer? Well, whatever it may be, if you noticed earlier, I gave you those pages in the heart of man that had all those different expressions of love towards others. I want you to take those pages and I want you to find the most specific one that you think would fit within the category. And again, just to give you an example of this, I pulled the workbook out, and I have in my workbook in front of you, I have all those particular things. My noun is a little rat-a-tattered here, but again, I have expressions of love, and there are hundreds of them that I got out of the book. And I will go to one that says, some possible ways a husband could openly express God's love through not being bitter towards his wife. Be forbearing and forgiving in his heart of her offenses to him, and express that forgiveness when she apologizes. Another one could be some ways he could express love through honoring his wife. Praise her in the presence of others. So again, you've got all these different things here, and basically what you'll do as you pull it out of the book, you're going to figure out what's the best course of action that you think would best express love for others. So we've got that portion down. So let's say you come up with 3. Now, number 1 will always be, when it comes to people, before you talk about 3 or the other 2, you're going to always put as number 1 towards others expression of love, which is sincere apology. So the first expression of love towards others would be a sincere asking for forgiveness for the sin they've committed, or they've asking a person for forgiveness for how they've sinned against them. So that will always be the number 1 thing that they will do. And then you would identify 2 other expressions of love towards others that they can walk in. So I want you to notice specifically, for each expression of love, you're doing 3 things that they could do. All right, so expressions of love towards God. You're giving me 3 ways they can express love towards God. And number 1 will always be embracing God according to his characteristics, and then 2 other expressions of love towards God. 4 expressions of love towards others, you're also going to give me 3 expressions of love towards others. And number 1 will always be sincere apologies towards the person, and then 2 other specific expressions of love you believe they should walk in. Okay? Now, with that being said, we have walked through just kind of in big picture how that looks from the observation to the interpretation in number 2 to 3 and 4 being application. Then we come to number 5. It says, identify further concepts you need to teach the counselee in order to help them work through their problem and walk in love for God and others. Now, if you follow, and I'm going to pull this out and put this back here for a moment. You remember now, I asked you to go to that section in your practicum and pull out key concepts. So now I'm going to pull out in my book the key concepts, and I have them already laid out in a workbook. And so basically what you do is you say, now, I want to help this person grow in their situation. So I find these to be the expressions of love issues that they have. So then you think, well, number 1, I need to teach this person about their particular issue. So maybe I need to teach them, let's say it's anger. I need to teach them a biblical view of anger. Another example would be, well, I know from the other class that I've taken that it's important to understand what you can and can't control as I was going through the research and material of the heart of man and the mental disorder. So maybe I need to teach them what they can and can't control. And so again, you have all these different options of things that you think would be best to help the person grow and to continue to grow in love as you're helping them walk away from their lack of love. And so these are concepts that you would give them. Let me suggest some ones to you that will always be there that you want to consider when giving this information. You always want to consider giving them what you can and can't control. And you always want to teach the concepts that are connected to the sin issue. For instance, if you find the sin issue is anger, then you want to make sure you teach on the biblical view of anger. You want to think about expressions of love towards others. You may want to teach them the biblical view of love, the 4 kinds of human relationships. You know, you just want to think in terms of logic to say, I'm helping this person grow. Here are the things I'm going to get them to practice. Here are the things I want them to learn about their situation according to Scripture, and the things I want them to learn in order to grow away from their situation and grow in love for God and others. Now, that pulls us together, and we've kind of walked through a little bit some of the details of how to do a case. But now what I want us to do is I want us to do a case together so you can see how this works. So again, if you turn to your page 26, we're going to walk through using the format you see before you and work through a case. All right? So let me just read it, and then we'll walk through it together. Jim is a 27-year-old male who lives in a middle-class neighborhood. Jim works for an oil company making a very good living. He and his wife have been married for 4 years. He married her after he graduated from college. For the last 2 years, there has been a change in Jim's behavior. Jim used to be a very calm and relaxed person. Yet over the last 2 years, Jim has had very extreme mood swings. At work, Jim seems to be more talkative than ever. He is basically talking too much to the point where people avoid him when they see him. Where he was normally focused on his job, he has become easily distracted by unimportant things, such as the sound of the air conditioner, the tapping of shoes, or even the sound of the Xerox machine. At home, he's asking his wife to participate in sexual activities that involve other women. He is constantly spending money on shopping sprees, causing them to be short at the end of the month to pay bills. This tends to last for 2 to 3 months at a time. Then out of nowhere, Jim disassociates from coworkers, wife, and friends. He does not talk, nor does he eat much. He talks about suicide and finds it hard to go to sleep at night. Jim would go months without touching his wife or having sex with her. He will even at times take days off from work during this time and sometimes stay in a hotel and not come home. This has been going on for 2 years. This started around the time Jim found out his wife could not have children. Now, as you read this information, you're going to read it over and over and over again, but you're going to have your workbook in front of you. And as you have your workbook in front of you, you need to think observation, observation, observation. So now looking at this, step number 1, you're going to be looking at observation. And as you look at observation, you're going to be reading letter A. It says, as you look at the characteristics of the situation or problem, are there any expressions of uncaused fleeing being demonstrated in this? If so, write it down. And we do see some uncaused fleeing in here. So whatever that is, we're going to write that down. As you look at the characteristics of situation and problem, are there any expressions of uncaused fear being demonstrated? And there are some in here. And so as we see them, you're going to write that down. Now, let's walk that through together. And then again, from A, B, C, and D, as we talked about. So within the context of this case, talking too much will be considered as a demonstration of what? Well, now, if you're not sure what that could be a demonstration of, talking too much, by looking at the case, you would pull out your information, remember, on negative expressions and say, let me see if I can find talking too much and where that fits. And as you look it up, you may say, and here that it may have a number 3 or number 4 by it, which means it could be apparent uncaused fear or apparent uncaused fleeing. So you want to look at the case to figure out which one it may be to determine. Now, in the context of this case, and as I'm helping you think this through now, this is what you would do again. Talking too much would be a demonstration of apparently uncaused fleeing. This person, according to the sense of guilt in their heart, the fear of God's judgment going on, they're choosing to flee when no one is chasing by talking too much. Okay? Now, let's look at another example. Within the context of this case, easily distracted by unimportant things. Now, what would that be a demonstration of? And you go, wait a minute, I'm not sure. So if you're not sure, you want to do your research. You want to pull up those pages to see if you can find that particular thing within the research. Again, negative expressions of the framework. And you want to say, does this fit? I'm researching. Maybe you don't find it. Then you may, if you don't find it, you go, let me think logically for a moment. Easily distracted by unimportant things. Where does that seem to be? It's not seemingly a demonstration of a sense of guilt, because that would be some way of being down on yourself. It's not necessarily you fleeing going on here. Well, if I'm fearful, I am always easily distracted because I'm so fearful because of God's. That would be a demonstration of apparently uncaused fear. So that's another logical way you can begin to work it through, but you have to know what each aspect of the framework really is. And this is trying to help you, again, draw these things out. Here's another example. So, easily distracted, that would be a demonstration of fear. Within the context of this case, asking his wife to participate in sexual activities that involve other women, that will be considered a demonstration of what? You go, well, looking at that, that's fleeing. And if you said that, you're absolutely right. So you would put down asking his wife to participate, you'd write that under fleeing. Now, within the context of the case, constantly spending money on shopping sprees, causing them to be short at the end of the month to pay bills, would be considered as what? Is that demonstration of fear, fleeing, sense of guilt? Well, you go, wait a minute, constantly shopping, and why is he doing that? What that doesn't make sense. Why would he do that? Well, think about it. If you've got the fear of God's judgment working in your heart and you're feeling guilty, what are you trying to do to get away from that? That's what this is. So that will be apparently uncause fleeing. And so you would write that down under there. So what you're doing in this section is you're just observing. You keep rereading the case and you observe, and where you're not clear, you want to pull out your workbook and see if you can find the expression in any of those pages that you've copied into the workbook. And where you can find the expression, you want to see what it similarly is like and see and make the connection to say, that doesn't seem like that'd be a demonstration of AU fear, because AU fear is this, sense of guilt is this, AU fleeing is this. And the more you research and then begin to evaluate and see how things work, you'll begin to process, and by the process of elimination in certain times, you'll be able to see where it fits in the frame. Now, you're going to be doing 5 of these, and all of these will be on your cases, on your quizzes. So for the next few weeks, you'll have the Make the Connection quizzes, where you do the first 50. That'll be your week 1 and week 2. So make sure you really look at section A, where I talk about how to make the connections. And then you will have 5 cases. So make sure, where you get confused, you keep reviewing this as I'm sharing it with you, to make sure you walk through this step by step for the first 5 cases that you're doing. Okay, so back to where we're going. Again, so we're looking at this case. We're still doing observation. Now, within the context of the case, disassociating from coworkers and friends, what would that be considered? If you said AU fleeing, you got it right, and you would write that down on this section saying disassociating, that would be AU fleeing. Now, within the context of this case, not talking, not eating much would be considered a demonstration of what? Not talking, not eating. How does that fit within the context? Well, that's AU fleeing as well. If you said that, good job. You would write that down under AU fleeing. With the context of the case, talking about suicide will be considered a demonstration of what? Now you got to go back again. You're going to think it through. You're going to do the research and begin to look at all those different possibilities of AU fear, AU fleeing as you're looking in your workbook, and you say, suicide, talking about, that's AU fleeing. And if you said that, very good, you would write that down under AU fleeing. Now, also within the context of the case, finding it hard to sleep at night will be considered a demonstration of what? Well, think about it. Again, not able to sleep at night. Some people call that insomnia. Perhaps you look up insomnia in your information and you go, insomnia, that's AU fear. Yes, it is. So finding it hard to sleep at night, that will be connected to that. So this is apparently uncaused fear. And so you would put that on your work of uncaused fear. Now, as you're doing this, you are analyzing and categorizing and taking these things to the framework like you were doing prior, but now you're going to lead this into a more deeper dynamic, because as you're analyzing and categorizing and taking it to the framework, you're going to use this to try to interpret, what do you believe the lack of love is that's causing this particular issue? All right. Let's keep going. Within the context of the case, going months without touching his wife or having sex with her. Well, what would that be considered? Well, you do your research, you look it up, you find that is apparently uncaused fleeing. And so you would write that under apparently uncaused fleeing. Okay, within the context of the case, taking days off and sometimes staying in a hotel and not coming home, those things would be considered what? If you said AU fleeing, you got it. He's not dealing with things properly. This is his way of escape. And so that will be put under apparently uncaused fleeing. Now, you take all of this, and we've done pretty much all the particulars of this, and so that's our observation. Now, turn to your point number 2 in your book. Identify the root of the problems, identify the specific sin, or what we call the lack of love or unloving attitude, word, or action towards God or others you believe is producing the sense of guilt, the apparent uncaused fear, or apparent uncaused fleeing. Now, you're going to sit back and say, I can't find this in a book. Okay? You may be able to find the characteristics in your book that you've created, but this part, you've got to do a little bit more processing and deductive reasoning to say, here's the possibility of what it could be. Now, you can pull out your workbook where you have those basic expressions of a lack of love that you put together under negative expressions of the framework, and you can go through and go, I'm looking at this general portion of a lack of love. Do any of these fit within the context of what's the possibility here? You can do that, but as you're thinking it through, I don't want you to get too locked in there because you say, well, I don't find anything on here. Well, great. If you don't, I want you to work through in your mind, what are the possibilities? Okay? So looking at this particular case, your question becomes, now, out of everything I just saw in section 1, observation, section 2, interpretation, looking at the case, what could the lack of love be and who could it be towards? Well, first of all, you look at all the different things in the case and all the different clues. You know, for the last 2 years, there's been a change. And then the very last sentence, this has been going on for 2 years. This started around the time Jim found out his wife could not have children. Well, as you look at that, you go, okay, well, now I'm starting to make some connections. I know it's a lack of love because of all the things that I see here. And it seems the lack of love is towards his wife. And you go, well, how do you get there? Well, because this all started around the time Jim found out his wife could not have children. You go, okay, well, that makes sense. So then, knowing that, what could the lack of love be towards his wife? What are the possibilities? And you and I would have to think about that. When he discovered that his wife could not have children, could it be that he was worried about it? You know, and what will happen? Or could it be he was angry at his wife for not being able to have children? Could he have resentment? And you go, well, you know what? That makes sense. That makes sense. So resentment towards his wife would produce a sense of guilt in his heart. And then he would have apparently uncaused fear, which is being demonstrated in the things that we see here. And then he would have apparently uncaused fleeing, which will be demonstrated in the things we see here. That's it. Resentment towards his wife. And so now, if that's the case, which let's say for the sake of argument here it is, and hint, hint, this is what you'll see on your your quiz. So when you do your first quiz, you'll see this here. So you may want to pay attention to that. Or when you do your third quiz, when you do case 1 on your third quiz, you'll see this. We're saying that we believe it's resentment towards his wife. And so you would look at that and you would say, that's an attitude. And so you put resentment towards wife, not being able to have kids, and you would write that under letter A, under number 2, because that is a attitude. Now, turning the page, let's say we've discovered that it's resentment towards his wife, and that's the attitude. Now looking at 3, we want to walk through. Given what has happened, he needs to do what? Looking at 3A, B, C, and D, well, he needs to confess and count on forgiveness for resenting his wife, for not being able to have children, and all the secondary sin that was revealed in the apparently uncaused fleeing. Now, by the way, if there was secondary sin, which I believe, and let's just go back for a moment, spending money in a way that he should not have and causing the family to have problems, is that a sin? Absolutely. So we're going to say that even though that's AU fleeing, that's also a secondary unloving attitude that needs to be confessed. Or having his wife or asking his wife to participate in sexual sin. That's AU fleeing, but that's a sin. And so the first one you go, well, wait a minute, how is spending too much money a sin? Well, it's negligence. Okay, so that would be AU fleeing, even though it's AU fleeing, it's a secondary unloving attitude, as well as the issue of having his wife to try to participate in things outside the marriage. Those are sin issues, but they're forms of AU fleeing, but they need to be confessed along with the main thing, which is resentment towards her for not being able to have children. Now, given what has happened, he needs to walk in open expressions of love towards God by doing what? So now, notice what we did. With letter 3, we've kind of walked through. He would need to confess the attitude, if you will, of resentment. He would also need to confess the shopping spree, negligence there, as well as the issue of trying to have his wife participate in sexual activity. He needs to count on being forgiven of those things. The areas where he needs to walk by the Holy Spirit, that would be in the area of the attitude of anger, because he's not walking properly in the proper attitudes there. So that'll be the attitude area where he'd need to walk by the Spirit as he does this. And again, we are assuming the count on forgiveness, be controlled, count on control. When we talk at letter C about walking by the Spirit, we're assuming and implying that as he is being controlled, that he's counting on control. So think about that when you do the framework. We get to letter D, what can we expect? Well, he's going to be forgiven. He's going to have the peace of God. He's going to be walking in confidence before God. He'll be drawing near to God. Okay? Now, I know we're covering a lot of ground, so review this as much as you need to as you're walking through a case. Now, we get to the part of expressions of love. Now, remember what we said. When it comes to expressions of love towards God, we always look at embracing God as the first one, and then you pick 2 others. So let's give an example. Given what has happened, he needs to walk in expression of love toward God through doing what? Now, I would say because he needs to embrace God, and this is about anger. Remember what we talked about before with anger. Seems to me that he needs to be embracing the sovereignty of God. He needs to be accepting what God has allowed, and he needs to be thankful to God for what he is working through in his life. So when we talk about embracing God, embracing the sovereignty of God, I would also add the sufficiency of God. I would also add that he needs to embrace the supremacy of God. Now, on your quiz, it only have one of those, and you will begin to think through to say, I think this is probably the best one. So looking at this situation, the three things that he would do is embrace God according to his sovereignty, according to, again, supremacy and sufficiency. He would need to accept what God has allowed. And again, where are we getting this from? Remember that worksheet that you printed out from the back? It has these particular expressions of love towards God. He would also, again, need to be thankful. So we would write those three things down that we believe he needs to do to express love towards God. Now, what does he need to do towards his wife? Given what has happened, he needs to walk in open expression of love to his wife through doing what? Now, number one, remember we said the first expression of love would always be sincere apology towards his wife. So let me give you some examples of what that could be he would do. So that's the first one. Two others. Let me just kind of spell it out for you. Confessing his resentment and second level sin to her and seek her forgiveness. Seek to identify ways to serve his wife and do so while listening to her hurts, struggles, concerns, interests, and joys, and respond to them with understanding. These are some ways that he can show love towards his wife. And notice, I gave you the confession, and then I gave you two others, listening and then doing a demonstration. Let me read that again. Confessing his resentment and second level sins to her and seek her forgiveness. Seek to identify ways to serve his wife and do so, okay, that's two, while listening to her hurts, struggles, concerns, interests, and joys, and respond to them with understanding. That's three. All right? So these are things that you will do in the case. Now, Section 5, again, application. Identify further concepts you need to teach the counselee in order to help them work through their problem and walk in love for God and others. Well, let's look at this, and let me give you some things. And again, you would look at the key concepts. You would open up your workbook and say, okay, key concepts in the back, pull that out, and you go, which ones would seem to best fit this situation? And looking at those, I would suggest that this would be 5 that you would use. What you can and cannot control would be something this person would need to learn. Angry people don't really understand that well. Understanding anger, since this person has a lot of resentment and anger, and they're pretty much the same thing, I would teach them that. The 4 kinds of human relationships. And again, you know this from reading the material about being open and loving, closed and unloving. You'd want to help him learn that. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, 4 through 8. What is love and how should it be walking in it? And then living with your wife in an understanding way. These are things that I would recommend that would be helpful for this person. Well, we have gone through in its entirety how to do a case. We walked it through how you put your information together, and we've gone step by step. If you get lost as you're doing your cases, go back and refer to this over and over again and just use this format as a way to help you. God bless you. We'll see you in Section 2.